Hi foodies, thanks for tuning in, and I hope that you're all doing well. We just celebrated the 50th Earth Day last week, and the topic of environmental stewardship, the health of this vast, beautiful planet, and our own health has been on my mind a lot lately. I've been wondering, what are the consequences of mining the earth for fossil fuels, metals, and minerals, both to our food system and our health? In this episode, I want to take you on a journey into the Boreal forest of northern Canada. This is a magical place, filled with the sweet scents of spruce trees, with a ground cover blanketed in spongy mosses, colorful lichens, and wild cranberries. Yet, it is also home to massive deposits of fossil fuels found in the oil sands, and oil extraction operations impact not only the forest landscape, but also the safety of wild foods, from animals to the plants that are found within. I speak with Dr. Janelle Baker, an ethnobiologist who studies the environmental impact of oil sands operations in Canada on traditional Indigenous lands and their wild foodways. Let me tell you a bit about Janelle. Dr. Baker is an assistant professor in anthropology at Athabasca University in northern Alberta, Canada. Her research is on the northern Bush Cree experiences with wild food contamination in Treaty Number 8 territory, which is currently an area of extreme extraction of oil sands. In this context, Janelle is currently collaborating with Bigstone Cree Nation environmental monitors using community-based methods and traditional ecological knowledge to sample moose and water, and partnering with microbiologists using a metagenomics approach to study the composition of microbiomes to map the source of potential harmful contaminants and identify markers of aquatic system health. Janelle is also a co-PI with Metis anthropologist Zoe Todd on a project that is restoring land use governance and bull trout population health in a contested area of the Rocky Mountain foothills in Alberta, Canada. Janelle is currently the North America's representative on the board of directors for the International Society of Ethnobiology. She is also the winner of the 2019 Canadian Association for Graduate Students ProQuest Distinguished Dissertation Award in the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences category. Janelle is a long-lasting friend of mine and so knowledgeable about this aspect of environmental health and how these extraction efforts impact food health. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Well, hey, Janelle, it's so great to see you again, even if it's over Zoom. And I'm really excited to have you on the show. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the really cool research that you're doing up in Canada.
Thanks, Cassie. It's really nice to be chatting with you today. My research is mostly with Northern Bush Crees in Northern Alberta, Canada. And that region just happens to coincide with the major oil sands deposits. So my work first started in that region in the context of traditional land use studies, in terms of consultation between companies and government and First Nations about their treaty rights. But I quickly noticed in that context that people were really concerned about their food supply. This is because they, mostly eat bush food, have a preference for it.
Yeah, so what is bush food? Just so people know, maybe this is a very Canadian term, but
it kind of is. Bush is kind of a funny word that you can really unpack. It's really, bush food is wild food, and sometimes I call it that in my work, too, just wild food. But the type of forest, the boreal forest that's in that region, people call the bush. And so, Northern Bush Crees, when they translate their name for themselves, sakâwiyiniwak, they call themselves bush people. So so their name identifies the landscape, and so that food that they get from the bush is such an important part of their identity. And like I say, this is the incredible preference. So I've met elders who have never eaten meat or don't like to eat meat from the grocery store. They still only eat moose and fish, from their region.
Yeah, that's got to be really packed with lots of cultural relevance, and it's also probably pretty good for their health since you don't have a lot of the same kind of pro-inflammatory compounds you find in a lot of farmed meats.
Yeah, yeah, it's they're lean meats. You know, just being out on the land, collecting that food is, you know, exercise and fresh air, and it's where people speak their language when they're on the land. So young people are hearing their language and learning how those bush skills. So, yeah, it's kind of everything, you know. It's going out for food is like what's fun and important and sort of the center of life there.
Yeah. Well, speaking about the center of life, let's talk a little bit about berry patches and what role berry patches have in community and in communication and in nourishment, and what is so special about a berry patch?
Yeah, the berry patches are just like this wonderful place, and I never get tired of going to them or talking about them. But, well, you know, I ended up doing a project for years with Fort McKay First Nation where we monitor their berry patches, and so we, you know, do air quality monitoring and testing of the berries. But we've also you know, just go and you know, as a anthropologist, I just go and learn about the cultural relevance of the berries and their stories. And so, yeah, the berries are definitely a gathering place, you know, and a place of great happiness. It's summertime, you go with your family. People are in good moods there. And I argue that those moods are sort of what people would call a protocol. So protocols like you offer tobacco to show your gratitude to the plants before picking them, so that so that you've shown them respect, so that they'll produce berries again in the future. But also like being in a good mood and not speaking ill of people or, you know, the landscape is also a really important part of being there. So when you're in the berry patch, people are jovial, and it's just a really great time. But, you know, it's also, you know, in the boreal forest, there's not a lot of fruit and vegetable options. And so those berries are a really important fruit nutritionally, you know, and calorie wise. So people preserve them and have all sorts of methods of storing them for the winter still.
So can you take us through a visual walk of what is a boreal forest like? Like, is it full of ferns? Like, what kind of trees do you find there? What kind of creatures? Like, I'm just trying to paint a picture of what this environment looks like.
Yeah, so an enormous forest that covers like sort of the north central part of all of Canada. And it's largely spruce trees.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very wide forest, so it has what we call muskeg. We even use that word in English, even though it is a Cree word. Um, and so muskeg is what I think people would often call a bog otherwise, you know. So it's like really mossy and wet. There's like a lot of peat moss usually. And you do get some higher regions that will have pine, which are like sandy soils where we do go for the blueberries. But yeah, to me, the archetypical boreal forest is spruce and boggy, with, you know, types of cranberries that grow in the bog. I get, you know, moose and caribou. So then caribou lichen, which is like a white, really dry, crunchy kind of lichen that the caribou eat. That to me, and Labrador tea would be the other really sort of archetypical indicator plant species, you know, that are even a cultural keystone species in the boreal forest. Labrador tea.
We learned a bit about. Yeah, we learned a bit about Labrador tea with Chef Sean Sherman, who came on the show last season. And yeah, just a fascinating plant and fascinating flavors, it sounds like, as well.
It's beautiful too, in this sort of subtle way. Like, you know, I grew up around it, and it's just like this leafy, bushy plant. But when you really sit down and look at it, like the bottom side of the leaves are this orangey, fuzzy, like rusty color that's really quite stunning. And they bloom, they have these white blooms, you know, in the spring. But again, like musket, well, so it's called muskeg tea in Cree, right? So the muskeg tea, and because it grows in the muskeg, and so it's like a pleasure tea and medicinal. And yeah, I would say it's a cultural keystone species. Like everybody has it. I've heard stories from people who are, friends who are a little bit older than me, that when they were kids, they used to go pick it and go to door to sell it, to get like a little pocket. Who's going to say no to a cute little kid who comes with a bag of Labrador tea?
Oh, that's great.
Maybe Sean Sherman talked about this, but it's also, how Indigenous people here first helped settlers, right? Because they showed up with scurvy, and Labrador tea is full of vitamin C. So, and it's really acknowledged as a sort of bridging plant, like a relationship plant in that way.
Oh, that's fantastic. And so you have Labrador tea, this amazing spruce forest, moss, right? Moose, lichens everywhere, and then the berry patches. So one of the things that you've really gotten interested in your research is the impact of environmental factors on the safety of wild foods. And you mentioned earlier the oil sands. And so what have you learned, and how did you track these kind of interactions between oil sands, pollutants, and the berries?
Yeah, well, that's definitely ongoing work. So right now we're working, we've taken kind of a new angle. I'm working with some fabulous microbiologists. And so we're looking at water and moose, but, from a microbiological perspective, to look at how the microbiota is being affected by pollution or being changed in the region. But typically we've worked a lot with toxicologists, so just trying to do studies. It's very expensive work in the lab, as you know, but looking at studies for heavy metals and volatile organic compounds that you find as a result of the processing of oil sands. We have found that, like with the berries, for years in doing this work, before I even did the berry work, I always heard elders talk about dust on the berries, and that dust was dirty and they didn't trust it. And they often got this kind of response, like, well, I'll wash the berries, whatever, no big deal. But we are finding now that dust in these mining areas is a major vector for heavy metals. And likely some is absorbing into the berries. Like, it's really not a good thing to have dusty berries, for example. But I was talking about their moose and water studies. But we've done various studies where we've sampled all kinds of important foods. So animals, medicinal plants, which we just categorized. We essentially, anything the community tells us is an important food, we accept. So we don't make that designation between medicine and food because the community members don't really. But we did previously do a study with Bigstone Cree Nation. We sampled 150 food items that the community considered to be important, or that they were concerned about being contaminated. This was with Bigstone Cree Nation. So they identified 10 of the most important species to them. And so they collected 10 of those 10, so 100 of those, and then 100, the extra 50 were sort of wild cards of whatever people had in their freezers or found in the bush they wanted to have tested. And we partnered with the First Nations, oh my goodness, the Center for Indigenous Nutrition, the Center for Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and Environment at McGill, and they did the testing for heavy metals and contaminants. And we found some of the things you might expect, like mercury in the fish. There was lead in some of the rabbits' kidneys, but it's expensive work, and that's just 1 year's worth of testing. So it's hard to really find, correlations or direction from certain, companies in the region at that point. So we're trying to continuously build the environmental monitoring program with the Bigstone Cree Nation. And so this is why the community really wanted to look at moose and water. So that's why we've gone this direction, and we've started looking at the microbiology. We've also partnered with an amazing lab at the University of Calgary in veterinary sciences, Dr. Susan Coots's lab. And so she's been previously doing this work, or doing ongoing studies with caribou and musk oxen in the far north, where community members have these kits. So if you're out hunting or if you're out with a hunter and they're harvesting or they're butchering an animal, they have these little kits that like walk them through. You know, you take a piece of hide and a piece of kidney, and you know they have a bag for anything that looks weird, and like notes on the animal that go back to Susan's lab. And then you know, then those members sometimes come and hang out in her lab and learn about how they do it. We just brought together some gentlemen from the far north, some Inuit men, with members from Bigstone Cree Nation, and we spent a week in her lab all just together learning about learning about how to use the microscopes and how to do the sampling and looking at parasites. And we spent time learning about zoonotic diseases quite a bit, because in the north they have some issues with that. And so it was really timely, because we all you know, had just spent this week learning about you know, diseases that are passed from animals to humans and what that means. So
Yeah.
the coronavirus actually makes sense to us. Yeah.
That's amazing, and such a great way to collaborate between, you know, field collections of samples, especially for animals that people are already harvesting for food, to understand what's happening with their microbiome and then the environmental pollutants. Yeah, I think that's such important work that's broadly applicable to different parts of the world, really, if you think about the impact of pollution on our food systems.
Yeah, like taking a bit of a bigger picture than just the contaminants, because yeah, like I said, we were finding that work a little bit limiting. It's still really important, but if you're just testing, say, for lead or mercury, then you just find about lead or mercury. We're not looking at the bigger picture. There are some toxicologists, you know, working on that, but at this point, it was really fun to expand. And the other thing about Dr. Susan Kutz's lab is that they work with a pathologist. So we spent a couple of days doing like autopsies, learning about you know, learn in the actual pathology lab, and that was a game changer for me, and thinking about this, because now, like, they recently found a bunch of dead fish in the Bigstone Cree community near Wabasca, and you know, the elders said this isn't a normal sort of fish kill, as you would call it, when a bunch of fish die off. And so now that we have this relationship with the pathologist, we can take those individuals, you know, those animals, right to a pathologist, and they can do like an autopsy and tell us why they died. And I know it seems so obvious, but I don't know anyone doing that in the oil sands region.
Wow.
You know, and even the food testing, like, you know, because most science in the region is driven by the environmental impact assessment process. So doing a study of, you know, predicting the impacts that a proposed project will have on the landscape, right? And everyone's talking about cumulative studies, but no one, like, they only look at a cumulative study within their own project footprint. They're not actually looking at all of the companies around them. And so you're not seeing this sort of responsive science, you're just seeing this predictive modeling, predictive science. So I'm particularly excited about this work, and yeah, and I mean, of course, it's the work the community is doing. It was their idea, and the environmental monitors are the ones actually out on the land doing the sampling and collecting, because they're the ones that know where things are going on, or know where there's problems, or they can go out with elders or hunters and respond to concerns people have on the land. So we find that a lot more meaningful. You know, we find that they know where the animals are, for example, in ways that you don't know by doing modeling or helicopter flyovers, right?
Yeah, because they're so tied to the land. You know, one thing I'm just thinking of as we're talking about environmental consequences of oil sands is that we haven't really discussed what is an oil sand and what goes into the process of oil extraction from sand. Could you just briefly give us a little bit of background on that, and what are some of
Yeah.
the pollutants that arise from that?
Yeah, so oil sands are a bituminous deposit of like a petroleum based product. So bitumen is like a really thick tar like oil. So the crude it has to be separated from the sand, and then diluted so that you can actually send it for even further processing, you know, to be useful. And so this is why only when oil has high prices have we seen booms in the oil sands extraction. And of course, as you know, as the oil deposits of the world are depleted, we'll see more oil sands extraction. But it's actually environmentally expensive, if I can make a neoliberal claim like that. It's, you know, and it's also very costly, energy intensive, right? So yeah, you like, and so the bitumen is in underground deposits, and in the Albertan context, it's only surface mineable along the Athabasca River. So the deposit is only close to the surface by this major river.
Oh, that doesn't
river, so
sound
like
good.
water.
That doesn't
No.
sound good at all.
No. So you know where I'm going, because these enormous mines and these enormous tailings ponds have to be on the river, right? And so there's plenty of valid concern about the tailings ponds leaking into the river. And also, where do you think they're getting all of this water from to wash the oil away from this, right? So, you know, as the deposit, like this is the Athabasca oil sand deposit I'm talking about. So as you go farther away from the river, it's deeper down. And so then the companies are using other methods to extract. So in Bigstone Cree Nation territory, they don't have open pit mines. They're on the west side of the Athabasca River and on the western edges of the Athabasca oil sands deposit. So they, in their community, people use mostly steam assisted gravity drainage techniques. So they drill kind of 2-kilometer long pipes into the ground, and they steam or heat the bitumen, and then it's pulled out with the other pipe. So one pipe is steaming and heating, and another one is pulling it out. So it's not a big open pit mine, but you know, there's a lot of air pollution. There's a lot of water intake. Some of them use aquifers for their water, but not everyone. Some of them are using surface water. You know, essentially, if there's no aquifer handy, then they use surface water. And of course, community members are also very concerned about the use of the underground water. They say it's drying out the muskeg or the bog that we talked about earlier. So those peat, you know, the peat moss, the fens, the bogs. People say that they see that drying.
Like
that
the essence of the boreal forest, basically.
Yeah. You know, this is a very wet environment. So if you're pulling all the water out, of course, people are concerned. They're also concerned about underground contamination. And, you know, I mean, climate change has got to be a factor, or even just heating from all this industrial activity and, you know, the pollution coming off the vehicles is also a major factor in the region. You know, you've got all of this industrial noise and dust and pollution from the combustion in the engines. And, you know, so it could very well be that the muskeg is heating too. So these mosses are drying out also just from a rise in temperature. Yeah, so you can see how it's problematic. It's also, you know, it's an alarming disruption of the landscape. There's no doubt that a mine is, you know, jaw-dropping when you see them, right? So they're loud, they're very large, they smell bad. You know, so it's very sensory for community members when they're out on the land, and for animals, you know, presumably.
Yeah. Well, how far what is the distance like between some of these ancestral Cree lands and the oil sands? Like, how far are you seeing environmental effects from the sands? We're not just talking about right next door, right? These are quite some distance also from the sands.
Well, it's a range. So Fort Mackay, who I worked with on the Berry project, and I say that in the past, but we're probably still doing some. You know, the community really, you know, they have a lot of their own locally driven environmental monitoring projects, and so their projects are ongoing, and we still have a relationship. But anyway, they're right in the heart of it. So I can send you an image of a Google map that shows where their community is and where the open pit mines are. They're essentially surrounded in them, and some of them are very close. So the issue in northern Alberta, this is Treaty Number 8 region. And the treaties were, you know, signed early in Canadian history, technically between the Crown or the Queen, it's federal, and, you know, and First Nations. And in Treaty 8, well, let's say the other treaties farther south, which is where the majority of the settler population in Canada lives, those treaties were signed, essentially to push people into areas to get them off the land so people could farm, and pioneers, homestead. But in the north, the boreal forest was never seen as viable farmland. And so people were given really tiny reserves to live on, with the promise and the assumption that they would continue their traditional land use practices on all of the remaining landscape. And so that is, these Treaty 8 region around the oil sands, that's all Crown or federal lands. It's not privately owned land, except for in the little townships, right?
Okay. And
so when we talk about traditional territories, the mines are literally right on people's territories. And these SAGD projects too are actually really close to the little pocket reserves where people live. But even more so, they're right in the middle of people's traditional hunting and gathering areas. And sort of, there's this sort of bureaucratic move that's been made where people identify their family hunting territories through their trap lines. So sort of a figure in a family is kind of the hunting boss of the family, and they hold the trap line, which is like a sort of a bureaucratic license through our government.
So what is a trap line?
A trap line is like a designated area that a person has the right to trap for animals, for bearing animals.
Okay.
So when like forts, when the settlers first arrived in the region, and these sort of like Hudson Bay trading posts, literally there were Hudson Bay trading posts in these communities, but also forts. That's how people started having access to cash and goods. But it was actually kind of an indentured system, because the local Hudson Bay agents would loan people, like give them guns and traps and tools to go out on the land for the winter, and people would go and like trap, and then they'd bring the furs in and trade them in with the Hudson Bay Company. This was the time that it was very fashionable for people to wear beaver felt hats in Europe.
That's like your top hat, your black top hat, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. And the women also wore a lot of furs, right? So they would go back to Europe, but it would just pay off, the rifles and the ammunition and whatever, the fuel, the sugar, matches, whatever people were getting at the beginning of the season. But it was like incredibly skewed. Like, you hear stories with people with like stacks, higher than the airplanes of beaver bringing back out of the bush. But anyway, so that sort of translated. So like several people, or a lot of people in the region, still trap a little bit for money. And again, it's a way of sort of showing territory or land use in the region. So like as someone who's a trap cabin and a trap line, that's also where they'll go pick berries.
Okay.
And also where they'll go hunt moose and net fish and smoke it and that sort of thing.
But it's not technically they don't own that land. It's federal land, but they have permission to use it, basically.
Exactly.
Trap lines.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's murky and like a little bit confusing, because non-Aboriginal people in Canada can also have a trap line. A trap line functions just like a grazing lease, if you're familiar with that concept as well. Mm-hmm. Also federal lands where a farmer can go like have their cattle. So there's very particular rules, like you can't live on this area year round. You can have a little cabin where you can stay, and you can do very specific activities. And you do have some consultation rights, right, around like what happens in that area. But yeah, you don't physically own the land. You can't tell people to leave it or anything like that. In the First Nations context, I mean, the treaty rights are combined with that, right? So if you're on Treaty 8 territory, on Crown land, people have rights according to treaty to harvest. So any treaty member, any treaty holder can go and hunt or fish whenever they want, technically in Treaty 8 territories. But if someone has a trap line, that individual will respect that person's access. You know, you give them permission where you would go on their trap line.
I see. Okay. And so what local people are finding then that are hunting these lands or are foraging for wild berries is that they're seeing changes in the landscape. Like you mentioned the dust on the berries.
Yeah.
The elders
yeah, and you read my mind. This is exactly where I was going to go, because at the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about, well, what is a berry patch and how are they defined? So berry patches, like there's certain families that have always gone to certain berry patches at certain times. So like, you know, some First Nations in other parts of Canada really have ownership over a berry patch, you know, in their traditional law. But in Cree communities, you don't really own it, but people know who uses that berry patch and they respect it, you know? And so what'll happen is if there's a mine or like a large industrial development happens on your trap line and clears out your berry patch, you no longer have a familial berry patch. Or like some of the berry patches that we see around Wabasca, they're still there, but they're right beside like oil and gas processing stations, you know, and there's even sometimes signs that say, don't eat the berries from the company.
Wow.
So even if it's still physically there, there's ones that people don't, or ones that are by the road now and they get covered in dust. Like no one feels good about eating those. Like you or I wouldn't go and eat berries, you know, beside a dusty mine, right? That's gross. So
yeah.
But the problem is in the consultation process and in the environmental impact assessment process, you know, companies all the time, or the biologists working for them, will say, well, this mine will destroy these berry patches as the community has identified, but there's, you know, this is berry habitat everywhere. So there's other berry patches, so so they'll say they have what they call no significant impact. And they'll also, like when someone constructs a pipeline or a power line, they actually will claim that they're increasing berry habitat.
By disturbing the soil? Are you kidding me?
Yeah, so they'll claim, and clearing the
Wow.
larger trees, you know, so that they're saying, well, we're increasing berry habitat, so we're actually improving the area for traditional land use. But of course, nobody in their right mind picks berries under a power line or on a pipeline. Like, so that this is really the heart of where my research came as an anthropologist and an ethnobiologist, because I was like, well, I want to talk about how people understand things to be contaminated, because there's clearly a disconnect, right, between this policy and what people are doing and experiencing. So even if berries in their community, they're not picking them because they don't trust them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. As they should, you know, not trust them. I mean, who wants to eat some from an environmental wasteland? That's just, Wow. And so in these environmental impacts, do local people, I guess it sounds like their rights are really restricted and being able to say no to these developments. I mean, how difficult is it to stand up to prevent further development of oil sands in different regions?
Yeah, so communities work really, really hard on this, you know, and there is a consultation process. There have been a few court cases in Canada that have, you know, made a clear ruling that the government is required to consult First Nations about the impacts on their treaty rights, their traditional territories, which is then passed kind of to the companies, and the companies do it through, you know, their environmental impact assessment process, right? So so the communities work really hard at you know, making their cases, but I've never seen, you know, maybe sometimes a company will move something a little bit, you know, a location of something, but a community has never actually been able to stop a development in their territory that I know of.
Yes.
Yeah, but so now it seems like when I first started this work, it was around 2005, 2006. That was right after the Mikisew Cree Supreme Court ruling, which is a northern Bush Cree community north of where I work, who you know, showed that they weren't adequately consulted about a road being built in their traditional territory. So since then, everyone was doing these traditional land use studies, and now I do really see this shift in energy being put towards community-based environmental monitoring, which is the area I'm working more in, I just see more funds all the time sort of being made available from the provincial and federal government for communities to fund their own monitoring studies. And most of those partner with scientists like we have.
Yeah.
Yeah, to sort of kind of two-eyed seeing. Sorry.
And this ties into my next question around the passage of traditional knowledge. And so traditional knowledge is knowledge passed from generation to generation around land resource use, around cultural traditions, the music, the language, the foods, the medicines of people. And I'm wondering, what have you found in your work around that angle of how has this been affected as land use practices change? And is the integration of communities in some of these environmental assessments, does that help to foster traditional knowledge because the wisdom of the elders and people that are familiar with nature is being taken into account during these assessments?
Yeah, this is such a complicated,
Yeah.
topic, right? And so I would argue yes, and it's sort of always been my stance that the biggest accomplishment in any of this kind of land use study consultation work is that young people go out on the land with elders. Sometimes it's their own family members, and sometimes it's not. And so like there's funding for people to go do that, and I think that's always really great. I think that undeniably, if you're physically disrupting the landscape, fewer people are finding places or access to the land, easier accessible. So lots of people in communities, especially communities or whose territories are really close to mines, will say they go farther and farther to go hunting or to get their medicines for stuff that's safe. But you have to have money. You have to have gas money. Like distances are large in the north, right?
Yeah.
Truck and gas and like it's a big endeavor. So so I do think that is a problem. And so I think in this context, like it's such a obviously a clearly political context, in northern Alberta. And so I always find it difficult when people talk too strongly about the youth not having access to their culture anymore. There's lots of people, like the cool thing is in some of these communities, young people speak Cree still, but that's always a good indicator. But you do meet people of a certain generation or age group who understand it but are kind of shy to speak it. And then then some people might say that young ones aren't fully speaking it at all. But again, I still do hear them speak or understand, and maybe some people are being more diligent about speaking it at home. So it's a bit of a mix, but you do see that concern of loss of access to the bush or people to teach you or ceremonies or language. But I also think that since the beginning of the Canadian government in Canada, there's been this narrative around assimilation, right? At first, intentional, bold, we're going to assimilate people, we're going to put them in residential schools. So we're going to take their culture away so that they can, be like us and everyone will get along or whatever, and that was obviously a clear and horrific failure. And so the sort of next wave of like extreme colonization in these regions is this industrialization of people's territories. And so, yeah, no doubt it's putting pressure on people. But at the same time, it's easy for, I think, like the Alberta government, for example, in our province, to make the argument that people are losing their culture so that they can say, well, this is an untapped workforce, let's recruit them to work in these mines. And then they're no longer a problem, right? They're not occupying their territories or hunting and fishing in the area. So, and I fear for the youth hearing these narratives, in that, it's got to be sad and depressing. And if you hear people always talking about how you're losing your culture, then maybe you don't have the energy to really work hard at embracing it, right? So
Yeah.
I think if we talk about, you know, how the youth that are revitalizing, who are actively learning Cree, who are actively out in the bush and celebrating that, I feel like that position is a much much more useful and stronger one. Like I say, I just feel like the assimilation argument is just a really slippery slope in enabling assimilation or believing that it's a thing, right? Like, if they assimilate, they would have a lot, you know, people are super resilient, you know, and you can see how the culture is resilient and how people, you know, still go on the land, right? So that
well, I wonder on that perspective of resilience, you've had the opportunity to work with many many really wise elders and be out in the bush with them and learn from them about their traditions. I was just wondering if you might be able to share some stories or tell us a bit about these individuals that have such a close history and tie to nature, and kind of what are some of the biggest lessons that you learned from them?
Oh, that's a big question.
I know. I keep throwing the big ones at you. Sorry.
Well, I would say that, like, just when I think I'm starting to understand something, someone will say something that totally, like, blows my mind and blows my water. You know, I've written a bit about this, but I find that there's a lot of humor. Like, you know, humor is sort of how you express and deal with things in the bush, and so you have a lot of fun. And when I first started working with Bigstone Cree, we were looking at a proposed really large oil sands development just north of Wabasca, kind of the main town or hamlet where the chief and council are based. And north of there is a little community called Chipewyan Lakes, and it's one of the most charming places I've ever been. It was a flying community until maybe 10 years ago.
So you can only access it by airplane?
Yeah, by float plane, or you know, by horseback. And so and then a local logging company made a dirt road there, and then Shell Oil, but they had a subsidiary company, which is what these big companies do. They'll start a little company with a different name, and then you know, start a project kind of hush hush, and then when it gets big enough they acquire it. But it was all along. And so they were working on this, and so I worked with a bunch of elders who are still like a family that I spend a lot of time with, and I go hunting with, and to their trapline and stuff. The Noskis is the family's name. And so yeah, so their trapline was being really affected. Their trap lines were being affected by this development. And so we were doing a traditional land use study. And so we actually, one of the things that we did is we walked the old original trail from the community to the river and down. So how people used to get to the main town, we used to ride horsebacks. And of course, it's really interesting because there's old campsites and old stoves and all these stories along the trail. So it took several days to walk it. So it was really fun. Got rained out. We got to stay in one of the elders' like log cabins in Chipewyan Lake, which is a beautiful lake. And we went duck hunting.
That's great.
So at the beginning of it, you know, the company required that in order to be sort of contractors or to be people doing traditional land use assessments on their own traditional territory, right? So here's the family, their territory is being, you know, about to be disrupted by this massive project. And they say, okay, we're going to consult you about what, you know, what's there, like your traditional land use in the area, because that's your treaty right. So we'll pay you to go out and wander around in the bush and like record everything that could be impacted and write a report, right?
Okay.
This was one of my first projects with Bigstone Cree Nation years ago. This was like probably 2006 or 7 or something. Okay, so but in order to do that, like Shell Oil has all of these safety rules. So weren't allowed to like carry chainsaws or a rifle or ride a boat to their own boat to their own trap line.
What?
Because they had to have like all these contractor safety rules. I'm working on a paper on this actually.
Wow.
Yeah, we also had all kinds of absurdities with the Berry Project like this too, right? Like the minute, because it's like, even though it was like a scientific study, the oil and gas rules apply. So suddenly places become rendered a oil and gas work site as opposed to a traditional place that these people have occupied for thousands of years. Right?
So they're supposed to document traditional land use, but not allowed to use all the tools that they typically use in traditional land use. Okay.
Unless we had safety. So we had to do like a 2-day water safety training course at the local pool. Right? Did that. And then we had to do a bear awareness training course, right? Because this is safety things. You're in the bush, you got to learn about bears. When we technically weren't supposed to bring the rifles, but of course, I'm like, can you guys please hide the rifles and bring them? Because
there are, and when you talk about bear, these are not little cute, cuddly black bears like we have here in Georgia. What kind of bear are you talking about? Grizzly?
Yeah. So there's a little bit of grizzly, but in that particular region, it's mostly black bears too. There's a lot of them. Like when I've been out in the bush, like hardly a day goes by where you don't see a bear, right? And you need to take them seriously. But I mean, this opens up all kinds of stories because of course Crees, the bear is like spiritually probably the most central animal in this region, and so they believe that a bear won't attack you unless there's something spiritually wrong. And so they say if you speak Cree to a bear, they'll leave you alone usually, right? But we're told, so this actually links really well to the story because, so we have to take a bear awareness training. So, and I'm sure it's really expensive because this was in the middle of the oil boom, so things were crazy expensive, and so like safety services and like these kind of training things were really expensive. So like Shell paid for a white guy to come from Athabasca, like a town that's like a couple hours away. He drives up and gives us like a 2-day, and we use the elders like traditional log cabin where like the elders would meet. And he gave us this like course on how to identify bears in the bush.
Wait. So white guy from the city comes out to the bush to teach elders who have spent their entire life in the woods and
like these people
tracking bears and
hunting them. They do hunt the bears there.
Yeah.
And so like they literally, people who literally came from a community where everybody speaks Cree, like everyone eats off the land because like it's log cabins that they hand built in the bush, right? Like they don't. It's not like they're not wise to the ways of the world. Like these guys, they go to Edmonton or the city or whatever, like in their lives, but like they've literally lived on the land their whole lives. And so they bring this guy in, and so it was like so absurd, right? And he could tell too, and he was like, to be fair to him, he was respectful, right? But he still had to like, teach us the way different bears act and stuff, right? And so some of the younger guys, because we always have youth in these projects, so they were there. One of the younger guys, had we got little cards saying we completed the course, and they're like, okay, now when I see a bear, I'll just kneel down and show him my card. But Dennis, this is where I first started learning about these, this again, and I'm still learning. I'm still a novice about sort of the spiritual aspects of the bear. And Dennis Nosky, he said to me like, none of this this guy says matters. And like I thought Dennis was going to tell me about like, how to behave in the bush around bears, right? But really, what he said was, a bear won't attack you unless a person with spiritual power has put medicine or compelled the bear to attack you. Right? So totally different way of understanding how animals behave. So he was saying like, bear is not going to bother a human unless essentially a spirit bear, a bear that's taken over by someone who's spiritually powerful, that they're trying to do you harm. And so like throughout my time in the community, I've had friends who will ask me like, are you having any weird dreams? Have you dreamt about bears? What happened if you did? because you can tell a lot about whether or not someone's trying to affect your life and your well-being through bears.
Oh,
and
fascinating.
yeah, so I mean, they
Yeah.
have like bear ceremonies and bear sweats, and I've even heard people talk about how if someone's really traditional, that they worship the bear. That's like a way of referring to them. So you can just, to me, the story is a way of showing just these extremely different ways of knowing and being in the world and relating to the world, right? So
Yeah.
you have to follow safety bureaucracy, and one is about how to be in relationship with a bear, right?
Well, I think it just sheds a lot of light on why it is so difficult for outsiders to understand traditions, because they're applying this whole other lens on how they view the world, and it's just such at odds with how people that are actually, as you explained, like they're embedded within nature. They have a different kind of relationship with nature than someone from an urban area ever could. And yeah.
Exactly. So and again, you can't really separate the things out, but I mean, right away, people, like, I feel like there's often sort of this aggression from scientists in the region around whether or not an elder really knows. Like, they're always trying to prove whether or not someone is right or wrong about their knowledge. But like, people who are on the land and pay attention and are there their entire lives going to the same locations to observe wildlife behavior, like, they have the most subtle indicators of change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like an elder will tell you, oh, the ducks aren't laying their eggs at the right time, or the shell is different, or, I've heard some people talk about a beaver's fur not being right, so they won't eat the meat, right? The fur was an indicator to them that something was wrong with the animal. I mean, then we see even more extreme things like disgusting growths on the fish and oil on ducks and things like that, where the animals are clearly affected. But even though, like, the really subtle stuff, my mind never ceases to be blown by these like incredibly subtle observations that people have, and I can't help but trust that and follow and learn from those perspectives. And I don't feel the need to prove whether they're right or wrong, but it's actually the communities now who are saying, we want to partner with scientists we can trust, who can also help further what we're saying or prove what we're saying to the outside world, because people aren't hearing us, and we want to show are being impacted.
I love that idea of, like, to be able to apply, to look at this through both the cultural lens and also Western scientific lens. Because this, like you said, those cues from nature can actually be really insightful. I mean, that's what ecology is all about, right? Is reading cues from nature to understand what's going on in a habitat. And it's just part of their way of engaging with the land.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, it's so largely seasonal in this context, right? When you have, a landscape, climate that is so based on, like extreme differences in seasons, I feel like you really see those indicators showing up in when things are supposed to happen. And those are embedded in like the Cree language and in the Cree calendar. Like the different moons literally will indicate to you what's supposed to be happening. And elders in the region I work, but I've also heard it from elders in the far north, they say these seasons are shifting. Like they're like, so it's not just like winter has totally changed, but like it starts later and it ends later. And I would say in my own personal life, I can agree. Like, when I was a kid, there was always snow on the ground at Halloween, and now sometimes we don't have snow until just around Christmas. And like right now, I'm sitting here. I mean, freak snowstorms happen, but like I'm sitting here looking at an extreme snowstorm out my window. When it should be raining. Like we should be able to hunt Easter eggs outside. So
and we're taping this mid-April. So that is.
It's pretty sad. So, I guess, so what I'm saying is I think there's something really important around those seasonal changes, like when migrational animals are supposed to be there, or when breeding happens, or when animals, like how animals will build their homes or their environments in preparation for the winter as well. So an elder I used to work a lot with, who passed away, late G-Bomb, he would talk a lot about the fur thickness, or what the muskrat or the beaver was doing in late summer, fall, and that you could tell what the winter was going to be like, and those are really strong survival skills, right? Because you're like, okay, it's going to be a rough winter because of the way they're behaving. We better get extra food, right?
Yeah. I mean, all of this is tied to food and health, and the way that, the observations of wild foods, of wildlife and plants are key to, making your provisions for the long winter. And, the safety of those foods, like you mentioned, the abnormal growths and things that are seen on some fish, being in tune to all those aspects is so important to health.
Oh yeah. And think of the anxiety, right? Like we started off talking about how it's healthier to eat your traditional foods, right? They're leaner. You're getting exercise, like it's not these like refined sugars and wheats and whatever. And so it's significantly healthier. But what if you have anxiety all the time about whether or not your food is safe? And again, that's another one of the major influences of my research, is just like, how do we balance that, right? Like, how do we say, yeah, clearly nobody wants to eat berries right beside an open pit mine.
Yeah.
Is the food in the grocery store any better? Which is also, in these northern contexts, extremely expensive. Fruits and vegetables are like really expensive and overpriced, and they come in saran wrap and individual slices, and it's just absurd.
Yeah.
So at this point, bush food is safer. I mean, it's better for all of us, right? So,
well, it's amazing the changes that can happen in the span of a single life, a lifespan. Because these oil sands, when were the oil sands introduced? I mean, are we talking 20 years ago, 40?
Well, the late 70s and 80s is when they first started building some of the mines. And then, in the last 10 to 20 years, they really, expanded. That being said, I went back fishing through the early historical documents, of the first treaty commissions and so-called explorers that came to the region. They saw the bitumen in the banks of the Athabasca River, like coming out of the ground, the different strata. And they wrote back, to Ottawa, saying there's no doubt that there's some value here. There's mineral value here. So, or even when they first signed the treaty, and they were saying, okay, a reason for signing the treaty is that we're going to eventually be extracting minerals in this region.
Wow.
Which was 1880s.
1880s. Wow. Well, if there's one thing you could leave us with, Janelle, like what would be the biggest aha moment you've had in your research, and kind of where do you hope to see your research go in the future?
Well, my research and my energy now, like, let's just say I did applied work for a lot of years, and then decided to do my PhD on this topic, and I'm now, in a tenure track position. And I would say that every project I do and every step I make, I'm thinking about ways in which I can help bring my courses and projects to youth in the communities. So where I want to see my projects go is that, or my work to go, is that community members are doing the work and able to bridge these worlds. So people who know their traditions, are grounded in their traditions, and can also do the science themselves.
That's great. It's all about capacity building, right? It's capacity building within communities. That's great. And with communities.
And there's already some really impressive people from these communities, like Bigstone Cree Nation. I know like several people with university educations. My colleague, Dr. Josie Auger, she's from Bigstone Cree Nation, and she was like a council member when I was doing my research, and my biggest champion. Like, she really made sure my research happened, and now she's a colleague at Athabasca University. So that's just like the most wonderful thing. But so really, it's about mentoring. So like even our moose and water project, we have community members. They're not that young. They're a couple of guys who are hunters who are the environmental monitors. So we used our research grant. It does pay some lab costs, but most of us who are partnered in the project are trying to use our own resources, and we put a grant towards the community members. So those guys are on salary. Like our project pays for 2 community monitors to go out and do the sampling and the work and be trained to do it. And they're also taking, because my university does online learning or distance learning, as a part of the project, we've enrolled them in courses that they're getting university credits for the work they're doing. So I have a course on community-based methods. It's an anthropology course. So that's the first thing they're doing, is interviewing elders and doing a project where they get feedback from the elders about what they should be sampling. And then, the next thing, hopefully they'll get some science credits with some of my other colleagues. And so that's really where I envision my work, is how do I support community members to be doing the work that I do, right?
That's great. Yeah.
In terms of aha moments, my goodness, I would say it's, I'm sure after we're done talking, I'll think of some big aha moment I've had. But, to me, it's a lot about the little ahas as well, like those day-to-day moments of listening, stepping back and listening, right? And kind of like the bear story that I mentioned with Dennis Nosky, because like that story sort of goes on, where I have aha moments all the time about bears and what they mean. And it's like every person I talk to, they might tell me the same story, but there's always like something new. And that always reminds me to just like slow down and listen, and I think that work in these communities is slow, and it is a lifetime of listening. It's not just sort of like what Linda Black Elk would call helicopter work, right? You can't just sort of helicopter in and out again with the information. It's a lifetime of listening and learning and working with families and communities, and all of those little moments along the way of like, I've written about this as well, but the berries can hear us, right? Like that's something, and all the different ways that they can hear us and respond to how we are in the berry patch, right? Or that the bear can hear us. So if we speak Cree to it, it can understand us. And sometimes a bear can even hear your thoughts, right? So you have to think well and speak well and be well, right? And it's all those little moments of like, how do we listen to one another, be well, have good relationships,
It's all about mindfulness and mindful intentions when engaging with nature, is what it sounds like to me.
And one another. Yeah. Well, in nature. Yeah, very much so.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Janelle, for sharing these insights with us. It's just fascinating work that you do. And I think there's so much potential for continued growth and collaborations with communities and community members. And I'm really excited to see how your work evolves over the years.
Thanks, Cassie. I'm so excited about your work as well and your podcast. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Awesome. Thanks. I'm Dr. Cassandra Quave, and you've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded on Zoom from home during the COVID-19 quarantine period. You can subscribe to the podcast on SoundCloud or on Apple Podcasts. We've got a fabulous lineup of topics and shows for you this season. Be sure to take a moment to share the link to the show with your friends and leave a rating on Apple Podcast. You can find all of our old episodes at foodiepharmacology.com. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.